In 1945, the world was silent. Smoke drifted over cities that no longer existed. Factories were twisted skeletons, bridges lay in rivers, and entire nations were starving. Europe, once the center of global civilization, had fallen to dust. Its empires were gone, its currencies worthless, its people exhausted. But across the Atlantic, something extraordinary was happening. A country that had entered the war reluctantly emerged not only victorious, but stronger than ever before. Its cities were untouched. Its industries were roaring. And while Europe struggled to survive, America was preparing to soar. In less than a decade, the United States would not only rebuild its own economy, but reshape the global order, shocking an entire continent that once ruled the world. When the war ended, two worlds woke up. In Berlin, Warsaw, and London, the sunrise revealed rubble. In Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, it revealed opportunity. Europe's infrastructure was gone. Railways, ports, and power stations had been destroyed. Millions were homeless. Food and fuel were scarce. Meanwhile, America was producing half of the world's goods. Its factories that once built tanks now built tractors, cars, and washing machines. The same industrial power that had armed the Allies now powered prosperity. By 1946, the United States held 2/3 of global gold reserves and produced more than half of the world's industrial output. The balance of power had shifted forever. Millions of soldiers returned home, not to ruins, but to promise. The GI Bill offered them free education, business loans, and mortgages. For the first time in history, ordinary people could afford homes, cars, and college degrees. Suburbs began to rise across the nation. Rows of identical white houses, green lawns, and optimism. Levittown became the symbol of the post-war dream, a vision of comfort, family, and progress. Every home had a refrigerator, a car, and soon, a television. In 1949, only 10% of households had one. 10 years later, almost 90% did. While Europe rationed bread and coal, America was mass-producing convenience. Factories that once built bombers now made kitchen appliances. Advertising turned consumption into a celebration of freedom. The American dream wasn't just about wealth, it was about identity, and it was spreading fast. Even before the guns fell silent, America had already secured its next victory: economic leadership. In July 1944, delegates from 44 nations met at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. They agreed on a new global financial system. Currencies would be linked to the US dollar, and the dollar would be tied to gold at $35 an ounce. This made the dollar the backbone of global trade. If Europe wanted to rebuild, it needed American money and American goods. The United States became the world's banker, builder, and lender. For the first time in modern history, global stability depended on a single currency, and that currency belonged to America. In 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall announced an unprecedented idea to rebuild Europe with massive financial aid. The Marshall Plan offered $13 billion, more than $150 billion today, to restart factories, repair infrastructure, and restore hope. To Europeans, it was salvation. To Washington, it was also strategy. Each dollar sent overseas came with a purpose: to strengthen democratic governments and weaken communist influence. The Soviet Union rejected the plan, calling it economic imperialism. But 16 Western nations accepted it and thrived. American cargo ships filled European ports with machinery, fuel, and food. Steel from Pennsylvania rebuilt bridges in France. Tractors from Illinois plowed fields in Italy. And every crate carried a silent message: prosperity has a price, and it's written in dollars. The Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild Europe, it rebuilt the world order, with America at its center. By the early 1950s, the difference between the continents was staggering. In Paris, bread was still rationed. In New York, supermarkets overflowed with abundance. The average American earned 4 times as much as the average European. Cars filled every highway. Movies and music exported an image of a new civilization, confident, modern, and unstoppable. Europeans admired it, but also felt uneasy. The land that once borrowed culture from Europe was now exporting it back, wrapped in glamour and profit. How could they do it? People asked. How could a young country surpass 1,000 years of European civilization in just a few decades? The answer was simple: scale, innovation, and confidence. America had mastered mass production. It had turned science into industry and optimism into an economic engine. But Europe was about to learn those lessons too. Through Marshall Plan scholarships, thousands of European engineers and economists traveled to the US. They studied assembly lines, logistics, and management. They watched how American companies ran like clockwork, and they brought that knowledge home. In West Germany, Economics Minister Ludwig Erhard applied free market reforms that shocked even his allies. He lifted price controls, ended rationing, and unleashed competition. The results were miraculous. Between 1950 and 1960, West Germany's GDP tripled. The Volkswagen Beetle became the symbol of a new age: small, efficient, affordable. Italy followed with the economic miracle. Factories in Turin produced Fiats for the world. France rebuilt with state-backed industry and modern infrastructure. What began as imitation soon turned into innovation. By the end of the decade, Western Europe's growth outpaced America's. The student had begun to catch the teacher. But not all of Europe shared this miracle. To the east, under Soviet control, economies were frozen in time. Private business was banned, trade restricted, and prices dictated by the state. While Western Europe filled with color televisions and consumer goods, the East rationed shoes, sugar, and gasoline. The Iron Curtain was more than political. It was economic, a border between choice and control, between prosperity and poverty. And it was clear which side was winning. America didn't rebuild Europe for charity. It rebuilt it to create partners, not rivals. By exporting its products, culture, and currency, the United States became the first consumer empire in history. Coca-Cola appeared in Paris cafes. Hollywood movies filled European theaters. Levi's jeans became the uniform of youth from London to Rome. This wasn't military power. It was cultural gravity. The world wasn't conquered by soldiers anymore, but by symbols. Even critics of Americanization couldn't escape its influence. The rhythm of jazz, the shine of Cadillacs, the promise of freedom. It all represented something intoxicating after years of war and scarcity. But there was more beneath the surface. The American way of life depended on something fragile: confidence. And confidence can vanish faster than it grows. Between 1950 and 1960, the Western world entered what economists call the golden age of capitalism. Factories worked day and night. Consumer demand seemed endless. Incomes doubled. Half of global industrial growth came from the United States alone. But Europe wasn't far behind. Its recovery became a miracle of cooperation. France and Germany, once bitter enemies, signed the Treaty of Paris in 1951, creating the European Coal and Steel Community. It was the first step toward a unified European market, a revolutionary idea that war-torn nations could share resources instead of fighting for them. The success was staggering. Within a few years, production soared, trade barriers fell, and the idea of a united Europe no longer seemed impossible. By the end of the 1950s, Western Europe was no longer looking up to America. It was beginning to compete with it. The Cold War transformed science into a new battlefield. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, a tiny satellite that sent a big message. America responded by creating NASA and investing billions into research and education. But the ripple effects were global. European nations followed suit, building research institutes and technical universities. Innovation became the new weapon of peace. Airplanes, pharmaceuticals, electronics, all industries born from wartime technology now served prosperity. The world that once fought to survive was now racing to invent. Yet prosperity carries its own dangers. By the mid-1960s, the United States was spending heavily on the Vietnam War, while maintaining massive domestic programs like the Great Society. The result was inflation, the quiet enemy of every economic boom. Foreign governments, holding billions of US dollars, began to worry. They could, in theory, exchange those dollars for gold. But what if America no longer had enough gold to give? In 1965, French President Charles de Gaulle tested that fear. He sent a battleship to New York Harbor to redeem France's dollars for gold bars. The message was clear. Even allies were losing faith. The US gold reserves began to drain. The world's trust, the foundation of Bretton Woods, was cracking. On the 15th of August 1971, President Richard Nixon addressed the nation. In calm tones, he made a decision that would change global economics forever. He announced that the US would temporarily suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. In that moment, the dollar was no longer a promise. It was simply paper backed by faith. The Bretton Woods system collapsed overnight. Currencies were set free to float, rising and falling on market speculation. For the first time in modern history, the world's money had no anchor. Europe was stunned, but also ready. After decades of recovery, it now had the strength to stand on its own. In the years following Nixon's decision, European leaders realized something profound. Economic independence was impossible without monetary unity. So, in 1979, they created the European monetary system, a precursor to the euro. It was a quiet revolution, the beginning of a financial alliance that would one day rival the US dollar. Germany led the way, its discipline forged by the scars of hyperinflation decades earlier. France balanced state planning with private enterprise. Italy and Spain modernized through exports and tourism. By the 1980s, Europe had regained its confidence. The continent that once lay in ruins now held corporations like Siemens, Airbus, and Fiat, brands respected across the world. The American shock had turned into European strength. The real transformation, however, wasn't just economic. It was mental. Before the war, Europe saw America as a cultural child, loud, naive, unsophisticated. After the war, it saw something else, a mirror of what it could become if it believed in possibility again. American optimism became contagious. The belief that progress was inevitable, that prosperity was attainable, that the future could be better than the past. These ideas reshaped European identity as much as American aid ever did. Europe didn't just rebuild cities, it rebuilt confidence. And that, more than money or machinery, is what truly ended the age of despair. The post-war era taught humanity that economic power doesn't come from conquest. It comes from cooperation. That trust, not territory, defines prosperity. And that every empire eventually falls, unless it learns to share its strength. The American boom gave the world a blueprint for recovery, but it also revealed the limits of dominance. When the US dollar ruled too strongly, the system cracked. When Europe imitated too closely, it risked losing itself. Balance, not control, became the true lesson of the age.